Hello and welcome to Chapmanomics, and in particular welcome to episode 4 of How We Write Paper 3 Answers. In the past few episodes, we've looked at the system as a whole, that Chapman system for how to answer essay questions. We've also looked at how we come up with our 2 points for our essays. Then we've looked at how we come up with the models for those essays. And today in this lesson, we're going to look at evaluation and how we put together our evaluative points that say maybe our theory here is not entirely correct. Before we do that though, we want to have a quick overview of the entire system, and then we're going to jump into that, how we do evaluation. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe to these videos in order that you don't miss any, so that you get the full Chapman system and how it works. Now, without further ado, let's get over to the whiteboard and let's have a look at that Chapman system as a whole. Here it is, our 7-part system for writing essays in our exams. And if you remember from our very first lesson, we decided that the best order to do the exam paper in would be to go backwards. That means start with the 25 marker in section B, work your way through the rest of section B backwards, then start your 25 marker in section A, and again, work your way backwards from there. We decided that was a good idea because that way you maximize the number of marks given the amount of time you've got. If you've only got 5 minutes left, I know I would rather be faced with a 5-mark essay rather than a 25-mark essay. So here we have our system. Point number 1, where we start with our essays, is we read the question and we note down any and all economics topics we can possibly think of that might relate in some way to that question. Second, we then reread the question and we're going to start narrowing those topics down to just the ones we want to talk about. So what we're going to do is make sure our topics all fit the question. If they don't, we're going to put a big cross through them and discard them. Third, we're going to find a case study or the case study. Now, in our case with paper 3, we're likely to have been given quite a lot of a case study. So we're going to find that case study and we're going to cross out any topics that don't fit the case study. Then, with the points we've got left should all relate to the case study and to the question we're talking about. And so we want to narrow the rest of them down to just 2 final points that we can then use to talk about in our essays. Once we've got our 2 points, we want to draw 2 models that are going to show great knowledge, great context to our questions, because we're not only going to draw those models, but we're also going to show a change in those models, how those models different after the point we've made has happened. After that, we're then going to look at our model and look at our point and find our evaluative point. And that's what we're going to look at today, is how to do that evaluative point. Finally, we're then going to plan the essay using the Chapman structure, which is what I'm going to teach you in the next lesson. Just like to stress before we go on to look at exactly how we do evaluation, this is only my way of doing it. If you've already got a good system that's getting you those great marks, then wonderful, stick with it, don't change. However, if you're struggling a little bit, you just want a bit of help, you want to know how to write these essays with a few more pointers, this could be a good system for you, so therefore use this system. Okay, now we've had our recap, it's over to look at how we do evaluation. So a great place to start when looking at evaluation is thinking about what evaluation actually is and what does it mean. For me, evaluation means what might mean that the theory we've been talking about, or the model that we've drawn, the outcome that our point has said, might not happen in the real world. What might be the negating factors that might mean that actually, when we're talking about an economic phenomenon happening, that something else might also be happening at the same time, and therefore that would negate it. So it's all about what your model or theory is saying and how that might not happen in the real world. Now, it's always also about being specific to the case study itself. We don't want generic points here. That's not going to get us top marks, but it's also sometimes not even going to be right. Instead, we want to be specific to the case study. So some ideas for evaluation in terms of paper 3 are below here. So what other factors in this specific case means your analysis might not play out? We assume in economics, ceteris paribus. We assume that when one thing changes, everything else stays the same. But in the real world, that's not what happens. So are there any other phenomena that might be going on that might mean that what we're suggesting isn't quite going to happen? What other factors are more important in determining the economic outcome? So sometimes we might be talking about development, And actually, we might be talking about something that is not the most important factor that's going to be developing a country. Maybe actually there's lots of wars going on in that country, or there's a dictatorship that's not particularly favoring one industry. And as a result, even if we talk about subsidizing the industry or taxing other industries, it's maybe not going to work, right? There's something else that's more important in determining that economic outcome. Do consumers and producers always behave rationally? What might mean they don't? Maybe we're talking about an information failure, and we're saying that we're going to rectify this by the government providing lots of information to people about their energy bills, for example. Well, realistically, who wants to sit around all day and read about their energy bills? I know I certainly don't, and I'm an economics teacher. And so as a result, I'm not behaving rationally. What would be rational to do is to go and look at that energy announcement and change my behavior as a result. However, I'm irrational. I'm not going to look at that. I'm going to go off and do other things that are more fun, as an example. And are there any other issues in the economy that might counteract your point or theory? So might we be suggesting that a big subsidy on infrastructure for a developing nation, so building concrete roads so that trucks can drive across them, are we going to suggest that that would be a really great way of resolving development issues? But actually, the country doesn't really manufacture very much, and so therefore there's not much to ship out. Or maybe it doesn't have many raw materials in order to ship on those roads, for example. That would be a nice bit of evaluation. So let's have a look at this, how this works with relation to a few questions. So we're focusing on the same questions that we've been looking at throughout these videos. And here we have the first of them. Evaluate the micro and macro effects of a depreciation in the pound. Refer to restaurants and other food delivery services in your answer. If you've not seen the previous videos, I'd recommend you go back to them to see how we got to these 2 points and how we got to these 2 models. And what I'm going to suggest you now do is, thinking about evaluation, I would like you to pause the video and see if you can come up with a couple of evaluative points of your own before I go through it together. So pause that video now and give it a go. How did you get on? If you didn't pause the video, I really would recommend that you do that in order that you're testing your own knowledge. It's all well and good sitting there watching me do it and saying, I get that. But actually, when it comes down to the brass tacks of the thing, when you actually sit here and do it yourself, maybe you'll find that you don't have as deep a knowledge as you thought you did, and so it's well worth actually practicing. Let's look at this and what I would do, and maybe you can do that for the next one. So here, in this first point, I'm suggesting that higher costs of food imports might reduce profits for firms. Now, this was, remember, in our restaurant industry, and this was our delivery industry. Now, I'm thinking that actually demand in this market is probably inelastic. I'm thinking we're talking about restaurants and food delivery. And I'm thinking, if you want to get a delivery of food, it's because you don't want to cook, you're not a very good cook, or you're having people round and you're having a nice time and you don't want to cook, you want to just order some food in. And what are the alternatives to that? Well, it's basically cooking or going out. And you don't want to go out because that's not really a very close substitute. And cooking, again, it's not really a close substitute to getting a takeaway. So there's not really much else that's going to be available to you. And so therefore demand is probably going to be fairly inelastic. Now, as a result of this, I'm going to suggest that these higher costs could probably be passed on to consumers. I think that what these takeaway delivery firms will do, given they've also got quite a lot of power in the market, as we saw in the case study before, I think they're going to be able to pass these costs on, and therefore profit remains the same. So I think they can actually just pass on higher prices to consumers in this particular case. And this is evaluating the point, because what I'm saying is that here we're going to reduce profits for firms, these higher costs. But here I'm actually going to say, I'm arguing against my point. I'm saying that actually in the real world, where we can push these additional costs onto consumers, well, profit is basically going to remain as is, right? Consumers are not going to behave rationally. They're not going to suddenly start cooking for themselves. Instead, demand here is very inelastic. And as a result, profit remains the same. Over here then, in our second point, higher cost of food imports cause inflation. What we're looking for here is we're looking to argue against inflation. What might actually mean that inflation doesn't happen? What might mean that this shift here from the LRAS 1 to LRAS 2, what might mean that doesn't happen? And by the way, just on the other side, we were looking at suggesting what might mean that actually profit remains here rather than just here. So now we're looking at what might actually not cause this to shift out and not cause this price to increase. Well, if we're thinking about the cost of food imports, being very specific to the case study, thinking about the cost of food imports, well, what else could firms do so that prices don't have to rise? So there's not actually cost push inflation here. When it comes to food, we're talking about importing food. Well, why not buy food from domestic production? And of course, that's got to happen in the long run because firms will have contracts for imports and things. But in the long run, they can switch their suppliers as much as they like. And as a result, firms can then start buying from domestic production. And buying from domestic production means that actually we're probably not going to see as big a shift out of our LRAS as we had previously thought. And therefore, we might not really get any meaningful level of inflation. These points, hopefully you're recognizing that these points here are arguing against the points here. So we're saying in the kind of the same breath almost that we're going to see higher costs for firms and therefore lower profits. But we're also saying, you know what, in the real world, our theory suggests this if we look at this model, but in the real world, actually demand might be very inelastic for this good and therefore we can pass on higher prices to consumers and still make a decent amount of profit. Over here, we're saying that higher cost of food imports cause inflation. But in our evaluation, we're saying that actually there's maybe not so much inflation after all. Let's pop that in. In the long run, we're saying there's not much inflation in the long run. So maybe this is only a short run phenomenon. So what we're saying is that our point and our theory suggests that one thing's going to happen. But in the real world, other things change. Not everything's ceteris paribus. And so therefore, we can talk about what those other things might be and say how likely they are to happen. And so here I've just written these points up a little bit more neatly for you. If you need to pause the video here and check over what I've written, check over these evaluative points, then please do and recap the topics if you're unsure. Let's have a look at another one and go through it a little bit quicker. So evaluate the macro and microeconomic effects of significant increases in the minimum wage. Refer to restaurants or other food delivery services in your answer. Our point one that we came up with in a previous video was that a rise in the national minimum wage will create an excess supply of hospitality workers. We need to find a way of arguing against that. So what actually might mean that the national minimum wage increases, but we actually don't see excess supply of hospitality workers. Secondly, increasing the national minimum wage will reduce inequality in the UK. Well, what actually might mean that an increase in the national minimum wage won't reduce inequality in the UK? What else might be happening that might counteract the effect of the national minimum wage? So pause the video, give it a go for yourself, see if you can come up with those evaluative points, and then we'll go through it together. Pause the video now. Let's have a look together then. So I'm looking at this first point and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking back to the case study that we read. If you haven't read the case study, go back to the previous videos. The case study is all there. Check over the case study and see if you can find this point in there. But I also know a little bit about these food delivery drivers, and I know that most of them are not formal workers for the companies. Instead, they're contractors. They work on their own hours and their own time. And therefore, if you increase the national minimum wage, it won't affect contractors. It won't affect them because those contractors can charge whatever they like for the services they provide. And as a result, we might not see a push up. We might not see an increase in excess supply because wages haven't changed. So what we're arguing here is in one breath, we're saying that a rise in the national minimum wage is going to create an excess supply of these hospitality workers. But also we know that these guys are contractors and those contractors aren't affected by national minimum wage legislation. And so therefore we might not see such a rise in excess supply. Over here, we're going to do the same thing. Increasing the national minimum wage will reduce inequality in the UK. Well, what might happen when you push up the national minimum wage that means this doesn't happen? Well, for me, I think that when you push up the national minimum wage, well, firms still want to make the same kind of level of profit. So therefore, in this case, I think that prices might rise to cover the cost. So basically, cost push inflation. And as a result, firms receive the same amount of profit because they've simply pushed up their prices to cover that extra cost, and therefore inequality remains the same. And so then what I'm arguing here is I'm arguing that the theory says you push up the national minimum wage and that reduces inequality according to our model here. But these things don't happen in a vacuum, and firms can respond to this in the real world. They can't ceteris paribus in our theory. They can't respond. But in the real world, firms can respond. And one thing they're likely to do is push up their prices because the national minimum wage has increased, and it's increased for all firms. They're likely to push up their prices to cover that cost and make the same amount of profit. Some firms even might be cheeky and push their prices up further than the national minimum wage and end up making more profit and actually cause inequality to rise as a result. And these are the things we can argue that are arguing against our point. They're saying that our point may not be right in the real world, and that's what evaluation is all about. I'm going to give you one more. Oh, here again, I've written this out a bit more neatly for you so you can pause the video if you wish and read these points and recap anything you're not sure on. Finally, I'm going to give you one to do yourself before we go through it together in a very, very short way. I'm just going to tell you what my evaluative points here would be to see what you've written and see what you go for. So in a second, pause the video and see if you can come up with the evaluative points for this question, which is with reference to extract C, discuss the likely effects of increasing integration in the food delivery market. Our point is that increasing integration will deliver economies of scale for Deliveroo, so we need to argue what might not deliver those economies of scale. And our second point is that increasing market power for Deliveroo increases prices for consumers. There's potentially not really any right answers here. There's just lots of possible answers that you could choose. There are some wrong ones which don't relate to the points that we're talking about, but there's not necessarily one right answer. So pause the video now and see if you can come up with a couple of evaluative points. How'd you get on? Hopefully you managed to do some evaluative points here and think about what might not be causing our points to happen. For me, I suggested that increasing integration for Deliveroo and generating these economies of scale that we're talking about here, I suggested that actually if Deliveroo merged with someone else, they actually might be too big and so therefore start suffering from diseconomies of scale. By becoming such a behemoth, such a giant firm, Deliveroo is already pretty big. That's that context. Deliveroo is already pretty big. If it gets bigger, there's a good chance that their management structures are going to start to break down because they're just simply too big a firm. Particularly, this will be an incredible answer, but particularly in the short run, whilst they're trying to work out who manages what and who stays and who goes and all that kind of stuff. Then on our second point, this increasing market power point, well, what I'm suggesting here is that it's going to lead to increases in prices for consumers. But on the other hand, it's possible that Deliveroo merging, as our case study suggested, they actually might lower prices for consumers so that they can become more competitive against their other competition in the market. And as a result, we get lower prices, not higher prices. So because they benefit from economies of scale, they can lower their costs, and as a result, they can lower their prices while still making the same level of supernormal profit. As a result, we get lower prices for consumers. So that's evaluation in a nutshell. It's all about talking about why these things might not happen, why our point might not be right in the real world. And it's all about focusing on the context as well at the same time. So think about the specific firm, think about the specific economy, think about the specific country that you're talking about, or the industry you're talking about, and really focus on what might actually happen in the real world. Why might our theory, that is, remember, ceteris paribus, why might that not happen overall? And this is what I would also be writing down on my exam paper, is I'd be jotting these things down as notes. So I'd have my 2 points and I'd be narrowing them down. I'd have my 2 models, and then I'd have my 2 evaluation points ready to turn into prose later on. Speaking of which, that's our next topic for our next video that is coming up shortly on this playlist. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments about evaluation or indeed about the system as a whole, post them down in the comments there and I will do my utmost to get back to you. As I say, next time round, we're looking at how we put all this into practice. If you haven't watched the videos before, I really would advise that you go back and watch those videos. But in the meantime, happy learning, and I'll see you on the next video.